The alarm cut through the ship before I even finished my sentence, and every sound in the cabin turned into a scream. I am Sefa Vel Karu, and I was not supposed to be afraid of anything that day. I had boarded the transport ship Varen's Hope with a simple plan. Watch the passengers, write notes for my study, find something interesting to fill my journal before we reach the outer colonies. I did not expect to find the answer sitting one seat away from me, in the shape of a quiet man who barely spoke a word. His name was Ethan Cole. He had boarded with a single worn bag and a told paper reading device instead of a modern neural feed. While everyone else in the cabin laughed, argued, and filled the air with noise, he sat still, reading, saying nothing unless spoken to. I found that strange, interesting. So I sat beside him, only for fun, only to study him the way I studied every unusual thing I came across. I did not know that within a few hours, that decision would save my life. The alarm blared again, sharp and endless, and the calm cabin turned into chaos. Passengers jumped from their seats. A group of traders knocked over their bags in panic. Somewhere behind me, a child began to cry. The overhead lights flickered from soft white to a warning red, painting the whole room in danger. I turned toward the window and saw them. 3 ships, unmarked, moving fast, closing in on our position like hunters closing in on something wounded. Raiders, the kind that did not ask questions before taking what they wanted. My hands trembled against the armrest. I had read about raider attacks in old reports, distant stories from other systems, never something I imagined living through myself. My breath caught in my throat. I turned to Ethan, expecting to see the same fear on his face that I felt twisting inside my chest. He was not afraid. His eyes had gone still, calm, focused, like a switch had been flipped somewhere deep inside him. He closed his reading device slowly and placed it into his bag without any hurry at all, as if the ship was not shaking with warning alarms around him. Then he looked at me, and for the first time since I sat beside him, his voice held no softness, only clear and steady command. "Stay low," he said. "Stay behind the seats, and do not look up until I tell you." I wanted to ask him what he meant, why he seemed so calm when everyone else around us was falling apart. But something about the way he spoke, the weight behind those simple words, made my body obey before my mind could argue. I slid down behind the row of seats, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The ship shook again, this time from something hitting the outer hull. Somewhere near the front of the cabin, metal groaned. The captain's voice crackled over the speakers, tight with tension, warning everyone to remain seated and stay calm, though nobody in that cabin looked capable of calm anymore. I peeked from behind the seat, just enough to see Ethan standing now, his posture different from anything I had seen from him before. Gone was the quiet, still man from earlier. In his place stood someone who moved like he had done this more times than he could count, someone whose calm was not a lack of understanding, but the opposite. He understood exactly what was happening, better than anyone else in that room. The door at the front of the cabin groaned, then buckled inward with a screech of metal. 3 figures stepped through the opening, wearing dark protective gear, their movements sharp and practiced. My stomach turned to ice. These were the raiders, and they had made it onto our ship faster than I thought possible. The cabin erupted into panic once more. People screamed, ducked, tried to crawl toward the back of the room, though there was nowhere to go. I pressed myself tighter against the floor, watching through the narrow gap between the seats, unable to look away even though every instinct told me to hide my eyes. Ethan did not run. He did not hide. He stepped forward, calm and steady, meeting the raiders head-on before they could even finish scanning the room for targets. What happened next took only moments, though it felt like it stretched far longer in my memory. He moved with a precision that seemed impossible for someone who claimed to work in simple logistics. Every motion had purpose. Every step placed him exactly where he needed to be. The raiders, confident in their approach, clearly expected an easy job, terrified civilians with nothing to stop them. They were wrong. Within moments, the 3 raiders were subdued, unable to continue their assault, their weapons scattered uselessly across the cabin floor. Ethan checked each of them briefly, making certain none of them posed further danger, before turning back toward the frightened passengers still hiding behind their seats. "You can come out now," he said. his voice returning to the same quiet tone I had heard from him earlier that day. "It is safe." Nobody moved right away. The shock of what had just happened held everyone in place, myself included. I stared at him from behind the seat, unable to reconcile the calm reader from earlier with the man who had just stopped 3 armed raiders without hesitation. Slowly, passengers began to rise from their hiding spots, murmuring in confusion and relief. The captain's voice returned over the speakers, this time steadier, informing everyone that the threat had been neutralized and that additional security would arrive shortly to secure the raiders until we reached the next station. I remained on the floor a moment longer, my mind racing to process everything I had just witnessed. When I finally stood, my legs felt unsteady beneath me. Ethan was crouched near one of the subdued raiders, checking on his condition with a gentleness that seemed strange given what had just occurred. "What are you?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at me, and for a moment, something flickered across his face. Not pride, not satisfaction, something closer to weariness, the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for a very long time. "I told you," he said. "I did logistics." "That is not logistics," I said, my voice steadying slightly as my shock began to fade into something closer to disbelief. That was something else entirely. He was quiet for a moment, glancing around the cabin at the other passengers, all of whom were beginning to settle back into their seats, some crying quietly with relief, others whispering to each other about what they had just seen. Finally, he looked back at me. 20 years ago, I served in a unit most people never hear about, he said. Our job was to keep people safe in places where nobody thought safety was possible. That kind of work changes you. It teaches you to stay quiet, stay still, until the moment you cannot afford to be quiet anymore. I sat down slowly beside him again, my earlier curiosity now replaced with something far deeper. "Why did you never mention this?" I asked. "All those hours we spent talking, you never said a word about any of it." "Because most people do not want to hear about it," he said simply. "And the ones who do usually want the wrong reasons. They want stories, excitement, something to repeat to their friends. I did not want to be a story to anyone. I just wanted to read my book and get to where I was going." I understood, in that moment, why he had seemed so different from every other human I had studied. His silence had not been emptiness. It had been restraint, control, the discipline of someone who had seen too much noise already and chosen peace whenever he could find it. The rest of the journey passed slower than the hours before the attack, though every moment felt sharper now, more real. Security personnel eventually arrived to take the subdued raiders into custody, thanking Ethan quietly for what he had done, though he seemed uncomfortable with the attention, brushing off their gratitude with simple nods and short replies. Passengers who had barely noticed him before now looked at him with a mixture of awe and caution. The way people look at something powerful they do not fully understand. Some thanked him directly, their voices trembling with residual fear and relief. Others kept their distance, unsure how to process what they had witnessed. I stayed close to him for the rest of the trip, partly out of curiosity, partly because I no longer felt like being anywhere else. My earlier plan of quietly studying an unusual passenger had transformed into something far more personal, something that felt less like observation and more like genuine connection. As the ship approached the outer colonies, our final destination, Ethan finally began to open up more than I expected. He told me about his years of service, though he kept most details vague, speaking more about the weight of the experience than the specifics of what he had done. He spoke about long nights spent protecting people who never knew he existed, missions that ended without recognition, the quiet loneliness that came from doing important work nobody could ever know about. I asked him why he chose to travel now, why he was heading toward the quiet outer colonies instead of somewhere more populated. He told me he wanted peace, somewhere far from anything resembling the life he had left behind, somewhere he could grow simple things with his own hands and watch the days pass without needing to stay alert for danger every moment. "You deserve that," I told him, meaning every word. He smiled then, the first real smile I had seen from him since we met. "Maybe," he said. "I am still learning how to believe that myself." As the ship began its descent toward the colony below, I found myself thinking about everything that had happened during our short journey together. I had boarded that ship looking for something interesting to study, expecting nothing more than simple observations to fill my journal. Instead, I had witnessed something far greater, something that changed the way I understood an entire species. I had always believed that the loud ones, the expressive ones, were the ones worth watching closely. They wore their emotions plainly, made themselves easy to read, easy to predict. The quiet ones, I assumed, had less going on beneath the surface, less worth noticing. Ethan taught me otherwise. The quiet ones, I now understood, were often the ones carrying the most weight, the most experience, the most capability, hidden beneath layers of calm restraint. They were not empty. They were simply choosing when to speak, when to act, saving their energy for moments that truly mattered, rather than spending it on noise that meant nothing. As we prepared to disembark, I turned to him one final time. "Will I see you again?" I asked, surprising myself with how much I hoped the answer would be yes. He considered the question for a moment before answering. "If you ever find yourself out here," he said, "you know where to look. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere away from all the noise." I smiled at that, understanding exactly what he meant. "I have somewhere in mind," I answered. We parted ways at the colony entrance, him heading toward the quiet countryside he had described, me continuing toward the research station where my studies awaited. As I watched him walk away, his bag slung over one shoulder, his pace calm and unhurried, I found myself smiling despite everything that had happened during our journey together. I finished my observation journal later that evening, sitting alone in my new quarters at the research station. I had planned to write pages of notes about human behavior, about the strange, quiet man who had caught my curiosity. Instead, I found myself writing something far shorter, far simpler than anything I had originally intended. "Some people carry their strength quietly," I wrote. "They do not need to announce it, prove it, or explain it to anyone. They simply carry it, ready for the moment it becomes necessary, and until that moment arrives, they remain still, patient, unnoticed by those who only look for noise." I closed my journal that night with a new understanding, one that stayed with me long after the memory of the attack itself began to fade. I had sat beside a quiet human simply for fun, expecting nothing more than an interesting entry in my studies. Instead, I had discovered something far more valuable, a truth about strength, about silence, about the kind of people who protect others without ever seeking recognition for it. Months passed after that journey, and though my studies kept me busy at the research station, I often found my thoughts drifting back to that ship, to that quiet cabin, to the moment everything had changed in an instant. I wondered sometimes if Ethan had found the peace he was searching for, if the countryside had given him the quiet life he deserved after so many years of carrying burdens most people never knew existed. One afternoon, nearly a full season after our journey together, a message arrived at the research station, addressed simply to me. I did not recognize the sender at first, until I opened it and saw a short note written in familiar, careful handwriting. "The garden is doing well," it read. "The mornings are quiet here, exactly as I hoped they would be. Thought you might like to know that quiet does not always mean empty. Sometimes it just means peaceful." I smiled reading those words, understanding the message beneath them completely. He had found what he was looking for, the peace he deserved after years of service most people would never fully understand. I wrote back that same evening, thanking him for the message, telling him about my continued studies, about how his story had changed the way I viewed an entire species I thought I already understood well. I told him that I hoped, someday, our paths might cross again, though I understood if they never did. His reply came weeks later, simple and warm. "Perhaps someday," he wrote. "Until then, stay curious. Just be careful who you decide to study next." I laughed reading that line, understanding the gentle humor behind it completely. I folded the message carefully and placed it alongside my research notes, a reminder of the lesson I had learned that day aboard the Varen's Hope. Strength does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it sits quietly beside you, reading an old book, waiting patiently for the moment it becomes necessary, and until that moment arrives, it remains still, peaceful, completely unnoticed by anyone who only looks for noise. I never forgot that lesson, and I carried it with me through every study I conducted afterward, every new species I encountered, every quiet individual I might have once overlooked in favor of something louder, something more immediately interesting. Because sometimes, the most fascinating discoveries come not from the loudest voices in the room, but from the quiet ones sitting patiently beside you, waiting for their moment, ready to reveal a secret far more remarkable than anything you could have imagined when you first sat down beside them, simply for fun. And that, more than anything else I learned during my studies that season, remains the truth I hold closest. The quiet ones are often the ones worth knowing best.